Just jump into the program. I think, yeah, we're at quarter after now.
Okay.
So, hello and welcome to this Ask an Expert session focused on nature-based solutions and net zero. So, the purpose of this discussion is to really be a deep dive into everyone's questions about nature-based solutions. And so we want this to be a conversation that's focused on the questions folks have on this call. You can join this conversation in one of two ways. You can ask to join by ask to share audio and video. There's a button there. You can press that and you can join us on the screen and you can ask questions directly. The other way is on the right-hand side of your screen, you will see an option for chat and Q&A. So feel free to just type in your questions there if you'd prefer to stay off screen, and we will be fielding those as they come up. So I am here today with Marcene Mitchell, who is the Senior Vice President of Climate Change at WWF. And in that role, she works with WWF's climate agenda and builds these synergies that go across the organization's climate mitigation and resilience initiatives. And she really has a focus in particular around these nature-based climate solutions. And before being at WWF, she also served as the Global Head of Climate Strategy and Business Development at the International Finance Corporation, and she's also part of the Green Bank initiatives in the United States. So Marcene has an amazing deep knowledge on these issues and how we can actually get from where we are to where we're going. So as I mentioned at the top, today's conversation is really about nature-based solutions. So just to kick us out, Marcene, welcome. Thank you for being here. What is a nature-based solution?
What is a nature-based solution? It's a great question. So the idea is based on the notion that if we have healthy ecosystems and we manage those well, that those ecosystems, nature, can provide essential benefits to society, health and benefits to society and services to people. So for example, we could take, say, mangroves, for example, right? So mangroves are forests that grow along our coastlines. And they are important. Not only they can sustain fisheries, so little baby fishes, they're kind of like fish nurseries, and that's where fishing often starts in the coastal areas, so they provide that. They filter water to help provide clean water. They provide valuable timber if they are sustainably managed. And they also can provide services in terms of climate change, because they can, one, help on the resilience side in terms of storm surges. When storms come in, they're a natural barrier from storm surges coming into inland. And they also hold carbon. They hold 4 times the amount of carbon that you'd have in, say, a tropical forest. So they provide all these services: water filtration, fisheries, resilience, carbon storage, and those are natural, nature-based solutions to societal issues that we have.
I love that vision of the way using what these systems actually do to protect us in a variety of ways. And I think when most people think of nature-based solutions, they think of forests. And you just mentioned mangroves also, and the different fisheries. But what innovations are there in nature-based solutions? What's exciting right now? What is there beyond forests?
Right. So there's a lot of things that encompass nature-based solutions. So some of the things that I like to think of in the urban areas, right? Nature-based solutions are great when it comes to water, right? Water is a big issue that we have, both from a climate point of view, where we have too much of it, sea level rises, storms coming in, but it also is good just in terms of managing our water and water scarcity. And folks in California know about drought and water scarcity. So how do we manage our water better? So nature-based solutions can help us with that, right? Often we look at being able to bring in marshes or things that can naturally filter water. Or I love the idea of, in New York City Harbor, they're bringing back oysters to filter the water. So you have cleaner water, just naturally bringing in millions, literally millions of oysters to do that. We think about nature-based solutions, again, in the urban, you might have seen things where you put greenery on the roofs or on buildings themselves, and that helps cool the building, so you have to use less air conditioning. There's just so many ways that you can bring nature into urban environments, and in order to help us in some of the things, versus having to build out hard solutions such as seawalls. Let's using things that we already have, such as marshes or Everglades or things like that, which can provide the same type of services, but it does it naturally and less cost and less environmental impact. So those are some of the things that we're really looking to do outside of forests. Although forests are a great way to store carbon and for other benefits that are also nature-based solutions.
Well, this morning during the keynotes, we heard Kate Collins from Oxford talk about some of the pitfalls around offsets. And one of the things she talked about is how important it is that these offsets be verified, high quality, and permanent. Can you talk a little bit about how organizations that are wanting nature-based solutions can ensure that what they're actually getting is high quality and verified and permanent?
Right. So what you're talking about is that often right now, corporations or cities or governments are trying to reduce their carbon footprint, right? They're trying to reduce their emissions. And one way that often people are looking at that is, well, we can either offset some of our emissions by investing in nature that could absorb carbon from the air, or can avoid putting additional carbon into the air, right? And so, but we have to be very careful about that as we do that. There's some good points of that, and there's some, areas that are difficult with that. I think WWF and BCG has put out what we call a blueprint for corporate action, in particular on climate and nature. And what that emphasizes is that there's a hierarchy of how to deal with emissions reductions. And the first and foremost, it's so important that we reduce our footprints to the most degree that we absolutely can. So if we do business as usual, continue to emit carbon as we are doing, there is not enough natural solutions to absorb that carbon. There's not enough offsets that we can create or that is out there for us to offset our emissions. So it's very important that step one is to continue to reduce our carbon emissions within a corporation or within a city or within a country. Number one. Now, if we are doing that, and we said we're working with the Science-Based Target Initiative, which actually for each sector and each area has a science-based way of reducing the emissions, how much every sector needs to hit every year going down to net zero by 2050. So if you're along that path and you're doing those things, then it's not a bad thing to invest in nature and invest in additional carbon, mitigation, carbon extraction from the air. Then the second problem you come up with is, how do we know that those investments that we make in nature to absorb this additional carbon is quality, it's impactful, it's doing the things, and that it has a good societal impact? We have to think about the climate justice issues. So organizations like ourselves, who are very involved in nature, really work and can work with corporations and with other entities like governments in terms of making sure that those type of investments will really be permanent, right? That they won't one day be here and then the next day not be here, so they don't actually give you what you want. That they're additional, that these are things that we wouldn't necessarily have normally done, and that actually they add additionality to impacting the issue of carbon, and that they have climate justice. That means that the benefits of investing in these things don't just go out of the local areas, but are shared with the communities, that are shared to build economies of these communities that don't continue to reduce nature and impact nature. So those three things that are really important in order to have what we would call a high quality investment in nature.
Wow, yeah, that's a lot, and I'm glad you've put together a resource on that. I want to ask about one specific thing, is that idea of permanence. And I see somebody in the chat is from Ashland, Oregon, which is my hometown in Southern Oregon. And I right now there's this, devastating fire, the bootleg fire that's in Southern Oregon right now. I'm going to actually share my screen for just one moment of this story that I saw that popped up, that where it says that there is that right at the time of this reporting, that 1/5 of the forest set aside for carbon offsets have been burned in the area. And this is just like such a tough issue as we're wanting to go into forests and plant more trees, and then these wildfires are getting worse. And can you help me comprehend this story and what's going on?
Right.
Would you respond
Yeah.
to this?
Yeah, so I think it's really important for, again, organizations like ourselves. We are very invested in science, right? So it's really important to understand the science behind, nature and biodiversity. Um, so, for example, in this case, understanding what are going to be the ongoing, not only what is the history of areas like this, so you can then basically you can compute what is the annual, fire, because having fires in forests is a natural process. And actually, you could argue it is a positive process if it's part of a natural ecosystem. What happens is that with increasing climate change, with increasing bad forest management practices, right, you get more than that. So using the science of what you need to do in terms of what is kind of a baseline of loss that you would have, what will be the ongoing impact of climate change on that particular ecosystem, what human changes you need to make in terms of forest management so that you will have those things. And then when you're calculating what you have for carbon offsets, you need to have obviously a type of buffer that will allow you to, anticipate that you will have some losses along the road. So all of that is really science-based, and we have great scientists. We have great people in the field that really know these geographies, really understand how these forests grow, manage the risks to the forest, and those risks have to incorporate all the changes, the impacts of climate on these forests going forward.
Yeah. And when we see news like this, I'm curious about the carbon accounting. Are there organizations that are still counting this towards their net zero goal? Is this just a negative? Is there any sort of feedback with the nature-based solutions to make sure we're not counting things that have been destroyed?
Right. So this is part of our blueprint for, corporate use of offsets and nature. Really, again, helping corporations and helping other entities that want to invest in a positive way in nature of how to do that, so that the accounting is good. And not all places are ready for that, but we are working with, for example, instead of working just on the project level, doing project by project by project, we're trying to work more on a jurisdictional level. And again, I'm talking about forests at this point. This is one specific type of nature-based solution in order so that we are having that impact that we know and can account. But the exciting thing you talked about earlier about innovation. So some technologies is really helping us innovate, right? So these days now we have drones that can look over and see what type of losses that we have. We can have satellites that can look over and see what type of carbon or methane exposure is being done in different areas. We can take pictures of forests, take pictures of wildfires, and see the impacts. So the good news here is that the technology and the innovation can be applied to really help us with accounting for and understanding exactly what our carbon balance sheet is.
That's so cool.
Really.
We have Jeff Seabright on the screen right now. Jeff, are you able to turn on your mic? Did you have a question for Marcene? Maybe not.
No, Jeff, you there?
Well, I want to encourage folks to ask ask questions to Marcene, you can do this through the chat, you can do this through the Q&A, or you can hop on screen and ask her directly.
Right.
So I want to get a little bit more into these science-based targets and initiatives. So how do nature-based solutions fit into the strategy of organizations' science-based targets? And also, if you wouldn't mind, can you just level set what is a science-based target?
Okay, so a science-based target is saying we need to be basically have no emissions by the mid-century. So by 2050, we need to basically transition, and this is the whole energy and carbon transition, from using fossil fuels, from emitting emissions through land use changes such as agriculture and pulling down forests. Deforestation is a huge impact in terms of emissions, both when we burn forests and emit carbon, and also we don't have those forests then to absorb carbon. And so we need to over the next 30 years, really change our economies in order to have no carbon being emitted. There'll always be a little bit of carbon, right? There'll be no way we can get completely out of it, and that's why you hear the term net zero. But that's really talking about by mid-century net zero. In between now and 2050, we need to have a measured way of every sector, every industry, every person bringing down their emission targets. And those are called science-based targets, right? How much do we have to bring down in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years, in the next 15 years? And so the Science-Based Target Initiative has looked at that on a sector by sector basis and really given a plan to how we bring down those emissions. So that's what Science-Based Targets Initiative is. Beyond that, and again, I talked about that mitigation hierarchy. That's the most important thing, is that we reduce our emissions. We cannot solve climate change just by saying we're going to plant more trees, right? Or that we're going to be able to do this through nature alone. We have to do both. Beyond that, you can, starting today, invest in nature. We have deforestation that needs to stop completely. Zero deforestation, and then we need to begin to grow our forests and for climate biodiversity, for the use of wildlife. Some of our pandemic issues is because we have, destroyed forests and nature, and we've got a closer intersection between animals and humans, and you're seeing that in our pandemics. Those are usually animal-human exchanges. So we need to protect our forests and our wildlife as a way of protecting ourselves. So in the meantime, investing in that is a positive thing that corporations and governments can do. And I just talked a little bit about how we make sure that we do it according to science, so that we have that permanence, so that we have that climate justice, so that we have that additionality.
Yeah, and in that Science-Based Target Initiative, I want to be clear that when we talk about science-based targets, it's a specific certification. It's not just like, oh, we used science to get to where we're going. There's actually a certified process that gets approved, gets reviewed. That's the Science-Based Target Initiative. Is that right?
Exactly. So, the first part is being transparent, right? It's for corporations and for other entities to really understand where and how they are emitting carbon, right? That's the most important thing. And disclose that so that their stakeholders, their shareholders, their customers, their suppliers understand where the carbon emissions are coming from. That's step one. And you'll often hear about, initiatives about transparency and disclosure. And that's really very important. But that's only step one. The second step, which is the harder step, is to say, well, what am I going to do about these climate emissions? How am I going to reduce those emissions? And that's what the Science-Based Target Initiative helps with. And then finally, as you pointed out, people need to be accountable. It's easy to say, oh, I'm doing this, but really being accountable so that we measure it, so that we know if we're on track or off track. And the thing I think is really important also to remember is we don't have to know exactly how we're going to get there to 2050. That is 30 years away. What we need to do is focus on what are we going to do in the next 5 years, the next 10 years, and continue to push ourselves, look at it as a challenge, look at it as a possibility as we work our way down to 2050.
We have a question over in the Q&A section that says, who are the key offset verifiers we should trust? And is there a global national standard they use, or are they proprietary to the verifier?
Right. So there's several different standards. I really would feel uncomfortable saying, trust these guys or don't trust these guys. But there are several really top verification entities, and this is a growing field, and it will continue to grow. And I think it's really important is that again, this has to do with the accountability and the verification, is that those standards are being used and being applied. And they vary, of course, from depending on what you're verifying, from forests to different landscapes.
Tiger, welcome to the discussion. Thanks for jumping on the screen. Do you have a question for Marcene?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Hey, Marcene, how are you?
Hi, Tiger. How are you?
Great. So I just wanted to share with you that we're one of the first climate solvers outside of Sweden from the WWF Climate Solver program. And I thought I'd shout out and say hi, and that we are working on nature-based solutions for providing cooling access to everyone.
Wonderful. So that's such an important area. We need to be able to, as we've seen all these heat waves, right? And this is a major issue, and that people don't tend to pay attention to. People, the drama of the hurricane or the major storms or flooding, seem to capture our attention, but we don't realize how detrimental heat can be. And then also we need to make sure as we increase our cooling that our cooling is based on renewables, because otherwise we're then just it's a bad cycle, right? It gets hotter, we cool, the cooling adds to the climate, which makes it hotter. So we got to make sure that we move our cooling onto a sustainable and renewable path. So I thank you for that work. And again, there's a lot of fun things out there. I don't know if you have anything to share, but I did a lot of work with green buildings and the things that you can do in terms of greening where we live, where we work, where we play, and how we can make that really sustainable and beautiful in our environment.
I have a question for you towards regulations and how we are looking at them changing as we evolve technologies to be more climate friendly and using better refrigerant technologies to work with it. How do you see this policy changing in the United States and North America to allow newer technologies or not in-kind technologies to come in to provide that solution for cooling and heating?
Right. Well, I'm always a proponent on putting a price on carbon. I think that can help quite a bit. But I think in the short term, what we're seeing is we're going to be having more changes in the regulatory environment than we are in kind of the taxing or carbon market environment in the short term, at least. And so I see, quite a bit of movement on that in the U.S. You're seeing new standards in terms of energy efficiency and electricity. You're seeing new standards, for example, and this is not in cooling, but say in electric vehicles, right? We're seeing a lot more of both incentives and regulations in terms of electricity. We're seeing more renewable energy requirements, which will really help in terms of greening that cooling. And I think that this can be not just at the federal level, I think it really can be at the state and local level. One of the things that I'm working on and the green bank movement, and the green banks are usually a public-private kind of initiative where you use public money to leverage private investment into green technologies. And so we're doing a lot of that, and a big emphasis on that is energy efficiency. simple things for homeowners to be able to make energy efficient improvements in appliances and windows and things of that sort, and in businesses as well. So there are a lot of innovations coming in that area, and I think regulations will help drive that.
Marcene, we're getting a few questions around land use issues, and I'm curious, here's one that says, is there a preference for nature-based solutions in urban or industrial areas over more rural, wild spaces? Can you talk a little bit about all of these different solutions that are available?
Right. Well, I think that they are both important, to be honest with you, right? I think that, when you're talking about rural areas, you have a lot of co-benefits to nature-based solutions in terms of for climate. So you have the benefits of biodiversity. You have the benefits of having intact forests that allow wildlife to flourish. You have the benefits of having large carbon sinks that you're not going to have quite in the urban areas, right? So I think it's very, very important to support that type of investment in these rural areas. In the urban areas, you're going to have things that are really much closer to impact on larger parts of the population, right? So we know, and this is again some climate justice issue, we know with these heat waves, and they're doing studies, and their different parts of the city are being impacted differently. Huge differences in temperature depending on where you live within the same metropolitan area. So nature-based solutions of making sure that you have shading, making sure that you have access to clean water, making sure that you have access to affordable, air conditioning, those type of things are going to be very, very important in urban areas and are going to affect large parts of the things. And then again, with flooding, again, nature-based solutions as a way of managing and preparing for flooding and sea surges are very, very important, because those are going to impact large populations. So different benefits depending if you're doing it in rural areas versus urban areas, but both are very, very important.
So there's one question here that I would love to hear your answer to. It's about Shell's commitment. It says Shell committed to 120 megatons of nature-based offsets by 2030. Is there any concern that afforestation, deforestation offsets will be snapped up by such corporate goals? And also on another level, what do you think about corporate giants like this relying on nature-based solutions to reach their net zero goals? Is there enough?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think something that I mentioned earlier, and that's why WWF and BCG put out that corporate blueprint for climate and nature. And again, I cannot say enough that, people are concerned with greenwashing. People are concerned with the fact that we cannot, offset our way out of this climate crisis, right? We need to reduce our emissions. So, to the degree that organizations agree to adopt science-based targets and agree to be transparent about them and be held accountable for them, investing in nature is a good thing. But to the degree that you're using offsets to continue business as usual and are not reducing your emissions in a path that is sustainable with the needs, then that's not a positive thing, right? And so whether it's Shell or whether it's any other corporation or government or entity, we need to the hierarchy is first reduce our footprint. And we can do that. There's so many ways that we now know how to do it. Obviously, we need to work on our energy systems, but we also have been talking about nature as a way of increasing that and helping us reduce our footprint.
Yeah. And what about the quantity? I think I've been seeing so many of these organizations wanting nature-based solutions for their offsets. What's the limit on the amount of nature-based solutions we can be relying on for offsets?
Well, I don't know if you're asking me an actual number of tons of carbon in terms of nature-based solutions or forests. I don't have that on the top of my head, to be honest with you. But I think in general, I mean, where we need to focus is one, in retaining what we have in terms of our natural areas. So one of the big concerns are our land-based changes. People don't recognize, everyone thinks about, renewable energy or energy, but 30% of our carbon emissions are coming from land-based changes, right? So for agriculture or for other reasons, we are changing the land. We are pulling down forests. We are degrading our nature and our biodiversity. So the focus has to be on how can we supply the things that we need, right? And particularly we're growing. I mean, we're going to be up to almost 10 billion people. And how do we feed all of those people without expanding our use of land, expanding the impacts on forests? So that has to be something that we all work towards in terms of reducing our footprint, reducing the scope in order to solve this climate crisis. So nature-based solutions and nature in general and land change in general is very, very important. We can't get there without addressing those issues.
Yeah, you were just talking about how much emissions come from just that changing of how we're using our lands. There's one question here that says, do you have science-based measures for new community developments?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I don't believe so. I think that right now the science-based target initiatives, and I could be corrected on this, are focused on business and corporate sectors, right? But I do think versus real estate and community development. But clearly, I think, and again, this is very optimistically and hopefully, there's been a lot of innovation in terms of, urban areas and what we need to do in terms of our transport sector, in terms of our density, in terms of making livable, walkable cities. We look at different cities where we have different modes of transport, more biking and walking and transport-based development, where you base your development on transport, around transport, versus this traditional spreading out of areas. So I think there's been a lot of progress in those areas, and there's a lot more that we can do. And the good news about that is it not only does it address climate and our land use changes, but it really also addresses, how we live better. So it's a win-win. How do we live better in these urban areas? How do we live more in harmony with nature, which we all actually love. We love living in green cities. We love being able to do more interaction with each other, walking and having a sense of vibrancy. So yeah, there's a lot of progress in that area.
There's also a question that says, how do you see the TNFD and the TCFD marrying up to accomplish multiple benefits? And that's the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures and the Task Force on Nature-Related Climate Disclosures.
Right. So it really fits in, as I was talking about, what are the steps that we take in order to, really reduce our emissions. And step one is disclosure and transparency and understanding where our emissions are coming from. And that's what the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures and Financial Disclosures and the Nature Disclosures are all about. We can't make changes until we know what our impacts are. So that is absolutely step one: transparency for stakeholders and shareholders, consumers and investors in these areas. But that's only step one. Step two is then figuring out, what do we do about it?
Hi, Philip. Welcome. Thanks for joining us on screen. What organization are you from, and do you have a question for Marcene?
Yeah, I run a startup called Hydrogas Energy, and we're working in Central East Africa. We're doing a project there which we're getting funding for now, which will treat this lake, which has a threat of erupting and issuing 2 gigatons of carbon to atmosphere in a day. Wow. Sometime in the next 50, 60 years. But it could be preempted, like 2 months ago when there was a volcanic eruption that nearly flowed into it. But we have a solution. We have a means of getting that methane gas, biomethane, out and into the power energy supply for the country. But what it does do is we can also, as part of that project, supply natural biogas by pipeline to two large communities, which add up to about 20 million people, all of whom currently use charcoal fuel, all of which comes from equatorial forest. That's a big drain on those forests. And you take the landmass of Rwanda, about 80% of the forest is gone from there. And the eastern provinces of the DRC, Kivu provinces, about 60 to 70% of the forest is gone from there. One would like to reverse that, but unless one has a credible alternative for the millions of people that live there, you're not going to go anywhere. So we can produce it cheaper. Now, this is, I think, establishing the credibility of a project like that is an important part of the process.
Right. So, and what is your question?
So the question is, in terms of pursuing the credibility of something like that, it's not core to the project itself, but it's an adjunct to it, which has its importance. It has the ability for those countries to start, let's say, selling offsets. Right. Because the project I'm doing can make the two countries or the Eastern DRC and Rwanda net zero or carbon negative by itself.
Right.
This is an additive to that.
Yeah. So I think, I think that the point is that we're going to have a variety of solutions, and it's going to really vary depending on the countries and the needs. Obviously we want to get folks who are dependent on traditional biomass, right, which, is often, collecting and burning of forests. The charcoal is bad for the health, and it obviously bad for biodiversity and wildlife. So we want to make sure that there's a transition to cleaner renewable energy. So renewable energy is one. If there's a source like this, obviously you don't want that methane emitted to the air. Methane is about 20 times more powerful in terms of greenhouse gas than carbon is. So we want to be able to use that productively. There is some controversy about, whether you use, if you're using gas infrastructure, traditional natural gas infrastructure, are you, helping and elongating the life of natural gas? There's some controversy over that. But I think that those things can be, reasonably dealt with depending on where the situation is. Where you're talking about, it seems like that has got to be a very important, part of the solutions, as well as bringing in renewable energy sources, to these rural areas, in order to deal with that issue of modern energy.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Philip. I want to make sure that we get to some other folks too. Tom's on the screen now. Tom, are you able to hear us?
Hi, Tom.
Tom, I think you're muted.
You're on mute. We can see you. We can't hear you.
Yosemite Clean Energy. I bet you're in a beautiful spot right now. Well, while Tom is unmuting, we have a question here from Jeff Seabright. How do businesses help scale nature-based solutions by working with governments, including jurisdictional levels? Is LEAF a good model? And I'm actually not familiar with LEAF. I'm not sure if you are, Marcene.
Yeah, sure. So LEAF is a new initiative. It's just getting kicked off. It combines, it's a public-private initiative. So on the public side, it's the countries of US, the UK, and Norway. And there are several big corporate entities such as Amazon, et cetera, Salesforce, other big corporations who are basically saying, if we work with countries who can supply these nature-based solutions and give us carbon credits based on that, then we have, companies that are going to spend up to $1 billion to buy these credits to invest in these areas. So it's a combination of the public and the private sector, right? It's creating this small market, and it's based very much on the demand side from the corporations. They must apply these science-based targets, meaning that hierarchy again. First, they have to reduce. They can't just come in to offset ongoing emissions, right? They have to reduce. So that's really important. On the supply side, which is what the countries are doing, the idea is that you're moving from just doing these little projects where everybody kind of calculates their own baselines, and when you add it all up, you've got more land than the whole country, to doing a jurisdictional approach, which is at the country level or at the state level, where you're really looking at the whole landscape, right? The whole landscape, and you're seeing how these carbon credits would fit in. So that comes to that issue that we've been talking about quality and transparency and accountability, and you're involving these governments. So I can't tell you whether it will, this is a very new initiative. They just are doing their first rounds. I believe it's closing in a few days at the end of July for governments from these different countries to put in their projects. And so we will see how well that works. But I think the concept of doing it at a jurisdictional level, of really requiring the companies to reduce their footprints first, and having the backing of the governments is really important. And let me just say one other thing. I think this is around carbon credits, but there are many ways in which the public and the private can work together to scale climate finance or carbon finance, not just through carbon credits. And I think that's a really exciting area. And when I was working at the IFC, we did a lot of work in what we called blended finance, where you brought in, and that's what the concept of a green bank is really, is using a small amount of government money to leverage a large amount of private money in these landscapes, both in kind of forest landscapes, but in many different types of landscapes. So you scale the amount of finance available to invest in nature.
Sure. Tom, are you able to unmute? I can see you talking, but I still see the little mute, the little line through your microphone. Well, while Tom's working with that, I have a question. I've heard a critique once from a friend that works in offsets, and I'm not going to name names here, but that there's been an emphasis, especially from the traditional environmental groups, around nature-based solutions over other forms of carbon dioxide removal that may not be nature-based, creating a demand for Shell, for example, that's leaning into nature-based solutions instead of doing other kind of carbon dioxide removal or investing in that. And the critique goes back to the question I was asking of, is it possible to do enough nature-based solutions to equal the kind of offsets that we're ultimately going to be needing, keeping in mind that hierarchy you were talking? Do you see a role for other carbon dioxide removals beyond nature-based solutions in reaching these offset goals and these net zero goals we have?
The answer is yes. I mean, we have a climate crisis. We have an urgency. In the next 10 years, we need to halve the amount of emissions that are coming. So any good idea, any way to remove carbon from the atmosphere that is credible, sustainable, permanent, I think is really important. I think the reason that people are turning to nature-based solutions are a couple. I mean, one, you get co-benefits. I mean, it's not just the climate crisis we need to solve. We need to solve many other crises in terms of biodiversity, in terms of wildlife, management, in terms of water scarcity. I mean, there's just so many boundaries that we're crossing in terms of not being in harmony with nature. So when you invest in nature, not only are you having a climate solution, either through storing carbon or helping with resilience, but you're also, helping on these other issues that we need as mankind to resolve. Having said that, the other ways that you can do it is direct air capture. And right now, the technologies, it's very energy intensive to do that. So the technology and the scale and the scope is not there yet. But I think that there are lots of companies that are working on it. It's something we need to invest in terms of research and development. And that could be a very productive way of doing that. We're just not there yet for that. And then finally, I guess there's carbon capture and storage, which is you capture the carbon right after you are producing it. And we often think about that in terms of, storing it from gas plants or power plants or cement plants or steel. Again, it's somewhat, it can be controversial because the question is, are you really reducing your footprint, or do you think you can just continue to produce the emissions and elongate these industries and not do that? Plus, again, it's been expensive and the technology has not really been there. So that's why I think I don't think it's that the environmental organizations have just been pushing nature-based solutions, and that's why everybody is looking at that. But I think that there are, at the moment, some limitations and some controversies over the other ways of capturing carbon after you produce it.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. We only have a minute left, which is too bad because there's so many great questions here. And I so appreciate how much time you spent with us, Marcene, and want to learn more about this. I want to ask this one additional question, which is about the perspective of biodiversity, which you just hit on. So from the perspective of biodiversity, will important projects be ignored because they lack carbon sequestration potential? Is this something you've seen? How do these things interplay together?
No, I think, well, two things. One, I think you can have both. I think you can have a double bottom line on that easily. And so from that point of view, no, I think that it's really productive. I also think, as I said before, that we can't have just two separate conversations, carbon and climate over here and biodiversity and nature over there. We need to begin to really look at our relationship in general with our planet, with nature, with the boundaries that can sustain us, right? And so I think it's by joining those conversations, I think it is a win-win for all of us. So I wouldn't pit those two things against each other, but really look. There's some initiatives, 30 by 30, which is saying we're going to conserve 30% of our lands and oceans by 2030. There's initiatives for zero deforestation. All of these are important. All of these will help with our climate crisis as well. So let's join some of these conversations and look at it as the double bottom line and the win-win.
Yeah, and something I saw within your role in that philosophy of these solutions need to be cross-cutting. It doesn't work for us. That's the thing about climate. It's so all-encompassing. We need to be cross-cutting. Otherwise, we're not going to actually get to true systemic shift.
Right. And I think the other thing to think about is, one thing that we do well is, I would say, as in the US in particularly, but across the world as humans, is innovation and creativity, right? And so once we put our mind to things, it's amazing the things that can come out of us. One of the projects that I'm loving that we're working on is in seaweed, right? So, and this is growing seaweed as a commercial enterprise. We don't have markets yet for seaweed other than, say, some Asian countries, Japan, for example, have consumed seaweed for a long time, but using it for other things such as animal feed, such as consumption, such as a replacement of income for fishing, where we're overfishing, and also as a way of absorbing carbon. Again, it is a huge carbon absorption. So using something that we haven't really thought about before and building that into markets and building that into ways that we can solve other problems such as feed, which we not using land and being able to use our other sources of nature is exciting type of things. And that kind of innovation, we're just starting with that. And once we put our minds to it, I think the sky is the limit in terms of this beautiful world we can build, being forced by this climate crisis, kind of the silver lining.
Perfect note to end on. Marcene Mitchell is once again the Senior Vice President of Climate Change at WWF. Thank you so much for joining us today in this Ask an Expert session.
Great. Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.